And I have the chat open, so if you want to say anything, or if I'm not speaking clear enough, or you want me to clarify something in the moment, just say it in the chat. I'll be able to stop. Again, I love questions and discussions and comments. Hopefully not too mean comments. But we'll go ahead and get started. The truth about Topsy, Edison and the elephant. This is actually a newspaper sketch of this infamous elephant that we're going to be discussing. Now, the elephant in question often has a very interesting story told about it. You folks might have heard this story before. It's pretty famous, especially in pop culture related to Edison and his hidden secrets or his secret lives or his wrongdoings and past mistakes, especially. The story often told, it comes up in the 1990s, 2000s. One article that really brings it to pop culture is this Wired article that I have bulleted. Edison fries an elephant to prove his point. I wonder what the article's about. The article talks about how Edison electrocuted Topsy the elephant, a circus elephant who was convicted of harming it and killing 3 men over the course of a month. And the elephant was supposed to be put to death. And Edison, always seeking a chance to discredit his rivals, George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla, quickly, during the War of the Currents, volunteered to execute this elephant using his rival's alternating current system, electrocuting this elephant in a grisly display of public execution and animal cruelty and poor showmanship and to discredit rivals. He kills this elephant with electricity and in a way to prove how dangerous his competitor's higher voltage AC system was to his own system, direct current. In fact, the story is repeated in a very humorous way in a Bob's Burgers episode. Now, if you haven't seen Bob's Burgers, it's an adult animated cartoon available on Fox. So it's basically in the likes of American Dad, Family Guy, The Simpsons, and the 3 children, if you see them on your screen, from left to right, Jean, Tina, and Louise, daughters of Bob, the title character. They're in school and they decide to do a history project on Thomas Edison. And in a way to expose their teacher's love of Thomas Edison as misguided, they find a secret book describing his execution of this poor elephant Topsy. And they promptly turn this into a large musical number whereby Edison and Topsy sing a musical number instead of actually describing a execution of an elephant. As you can see, Jean there is pulling off a pretty good Thomas Edison, and I think Tina's doing a pretty good job pulling off Topsy with those homemade costumes. So if you folks want to celebrate Halloween, you can start preparing for those costumes a little ahead of time. So that's often the story that's told, basically. Now, this elephant, to give you some backstory, the elephant Topsy, which was actually named after a character in the very controversial book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This baby elephant was part of the show, which you see a circus poster of this circus, the Great Four Paw and Sells Brothers show combined circus. It premieres in the 1890s, 1895, and this was during the time when elephants were first being brought to the United States, and this is really the height of circuses in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And the circus advertised this Topsy the elephant as the first elephant born in the United States. That's their claim to fame. This baby elephant was one of the first elephants to ever been born in the United States. It was a lie. The elephant was actually smuggled from Thailand by the circus. One of their chief rivals, P.T. Barnum, actually discredits this story. They soon dropped the line that this young elephant named Topsy was born in the United States, but they still advertised the elephant was born, the first elephant born outside of the tropics. Another lie, as it was born in Thailand. Well, this elephant, as was not uncommon for circuses, especially in the time period, late 20th or late 19th century, early 20th century, this circus just went town to town, really just exploiting, abusing animals, putting them in cages, and circus elephants, especially being very large and being very relatively new to circuses and those in the United States, very easy to anger. And it wasn't unusual for there to be a headline in a newspaper that one of the circus elephants that just so happened to be in your rural town or your big city show had attacked and injured a caretaker or a spectator. And this is what Topsy does. As I said, not unusual. In 1900, it actually attacked 2 spectators who were abusing Topsy by throwing food and poking it. In 1902, Topsy, which remember earlier, the whole story was that Topsy killed 3 people in 3 months. I and other authors, including Michael Daly, who wrote the book called Topsy, he actually found no evidence of Topsy only killing more than 1 person. He does unfortunately kill someone, or should I say she, Topsy, she's a female Indian elephant. She actually unfortunately does kill a handler. The newspapers at the time said the elephant had every right to kill its handler, as the elephant handler, James Blunt, comes into the circus elephant tent. He's warned to stay away from the elephant in such a drunken manner. He starts messing with the elephants, throwing sand on them, and when he gets to Topsy, who either was the 10th or 13th elephant in the line of elephants he was abusing, he gets too close and Topsy grabs him through the cage by the trunk, lifts him up, throws him down, pulls him into the cage, and crushes him with her right foot. The elephant is separated from the body, and the elephant actually, nothing's done. Kills its handler. The circus, Farman Brothers, Powell and Sells Circus, they, as well as the newspapers, actually were very sympathetic, to Topsy. They actually thought that it was a little harsh that the handler's death was basically, he had it coming. So unfortunately, Topsy ends up killing one of her handlers. 5 days later, while offloading the elephants for a short break after traveling on the train, a spectator walks up to the elephant and begins poking Topsy in the ear with a stick, as one does, poking elephants in the ear with a stick. Topsy, again, grabs the man, lifts him up in the air with her trunk, and throws him down and goes to raise up her right foot before her handlers and other circus officials are able to get her away from the man, and the man escapes with minor injuries. After that death, and 5 days later, another attack on not a circus employee, but a random person at a train station, Fort Powell Circus decides to sell Topsy. Again, the elephant trade was very popular at this time. Some people would sell their elephants to zoos, other circuses, and they decided to sell their elephant Topsy to a amusement park in Luna Park, Coney Island. It was going to be an amusement park basically themed after the moon, specifically the classic film Journey to the Moon. Well, in 1903, Luna Park buys Topsy and begins putting her to work right away and basically labor, using her to raise large columns and build the amusement parks and the attractions for Luna Park that was about to be open. In 1903, she was trying to pull a large barge into this park. However, it was too heavy for her. She couldn't get the barge up. Her handler began stabbing her with a pitchfork. Onlookers began yelling at the man to stop abusing this poor elephant who's unable to lift such a heavy item, even for an elephant. A young woman actually approaches him and starts yelling at the man. The man calls her some vulgar and vile words. A police officer comes over, orders him to stop abusing the elephant. In a cruel sense of humor, And so he stops abusing the elephant, but then he releases Topsy from her restraints and basically causes her to run down the street in Coney Island. The man's arrested. He's booked on a $600 bail. The elephant, it was pretty funny at the time, not the pitchfork thing, that was horrible, but the after effect, because this crowd that had gathered, half of the crowd follows the man to be arrested and watch this whole show of a man being basically arrested for abusing an animal. And the other half follows Topsy, wandering down the street. And eventually the police are able to corral Topsy and get her safely back into custody of the Luna Park officials at the amusement park. After that, and publicity and newspaper reports talking about this elephant and how she'd killed a man just a year earlier, and other false newspaper reports that she killed a man in Boston and another one in Waco, there's a lot of bad publicity with this elephant. And originally, Luna Park were going to have Topsy so children could ride on Topsy. It was going to be an attraction. The children could ride the elephant. However, with such a, quote, bad elephant, as the term would be used at the time, they decide that it's time to put Topsy down for PR reasons. So it's a real tragedy and really shows the disrespect to animals, especially at the time. Executing elephants wasn't something people even batted an eye at. Just a year before, P.T. Barnum actually executed 6 of its elephants while on tour in Europe. An elephant, even at one of the zoos in New York, was killed by being fed poison by its handler in front of visitors to the zoo. The ASPCA, they had no comment really, but for whatever reason, the ASPCA, this animal rights group, they decide to actually protect Topsy. They think that the traditional manner of execution for animals of this size, hanging, was too cruel. So they decide with Luna Park officials to have a humane euthanasia of the elephant. They agree with Luna Park officials that the elephant wasn't going to be hanged, rather electrocuted. They had actually worked in the past with Thomas Edison. This is where he comes in. And Thomas Edison had done tests on euthanasia of animals, or should I say more humane ways of euthanasia of animals, especially dogs. The ASPCA, they have a deal to make sure that the elephant dies when they are killing Topsy. They decide to strangle Topsy after the electrocution. So after the electrocution, they strangle her for 10 minutes and she's finally declared dead. Officials on the scene do declare that she had died from the 10 to 13 second bolt of electricity that was sent through a pad connecting her copper shackles on her feet through her body. So sadly, Topsy is executed, and as you can see from this photograph, there is a small crowd that gathered. People actually took the streetcars to watch the execution of the elephant. Again, this is 1903, Coney Island. So onlookers, again, executing an elephant was seen as an event, but not something extremely cruel as it would be and or might be seen today. Now, this execution, it gets a couple of newspaper articles, but it largely falls to the wayside. It's almost forgotten. Until about the 1960s, when some authors revived this story, and I said it really comes to prominent attention, linking Edison to this electrocution in this 2008 Wired article. So, why is Edison connected to this elephant at all? Well, first of all, the War of the Currents, taking place from 1885 to 1892. People credited, as I said, with the very riveting play that Bob's Burgers did, that Edison used this elephant as a way to electrocute Edison, or execute Topsy. And, oh, got a question. Do we know if the equipment used for the electrocution was indeed manufactured by Westinghouse and utilized alternating current? It did. it did in fact use alternating current. Now, Edison uses direct current. Westinghouse uses Nikola Tesla's alternating current. And alternating current by 1903 is the preferred system of electrification, excuse me. As you see from the years, the execution of Topsy took place in 1903. The War of the Currents was over in 1892. So the War of the Currents had been over for over 8 years by that point. So whenever Topsy was electrocuted, they did use AC system as they were using the electricity available at Coney Island. However, Edison workers are sent to assist the installation of the electrical system. So Edison workers are sent on the request of Luna Park officials, as basically the Edison officials and workers at the Edison Aluminum Company, soon to become at that point, the General Electric Company, or Edison General Electric. They had been basically called upon to do some electrical work, which just so happened to be the execution of this elephant. So they do use Westinghouse's power plant over 50 miles away because DC was basically done by this point. But Edison workers do install AC systems on this elephant in the use of its execution. Now, during the War of the Currents, there is every right to point blame at Thomas Edison for electrocuting animals, but not Topsy. As I said earlier, the Society for the Protection of Animals, they actually contracted Edison. They reached out to Edison to find a more humane way of euthanasia. In the 1880s, the popular form of euthanasia was sadly drowning. Drowning of dogs and cats, a brutal and inhumane way of euthanasia. So they figured that compared to drowning, electrocution would be a better system. And Edison does electrocute several dogs, even a cow and a horse, testing systems of electrocution. And it was during this time in the War of the Currents when he was contacted by the Society for the Protection of Animals to test humane ways of euthanasia that he finds that AC system is the most humane way of execution, and that later is taken advantage of by Edison's basically marketing team. They basically used these tests that they were contracted to do for another purpose. So they weren't showing people how it was a more humane way to go. They were just saying it was more dangerous than direct current because AC was a way of euthanasia for animals, and later even the electric chair, which is a story for another day, by the way. So Edison gets a lot of blame because of his involvement in the War of the Currents and how just messy the whole system was, which, by the way, the whole War of the Currents is a story, maybe even two in itself, using, tragic deaths of linemen working electrical systems and the experiments for the Society for the Protection of Animals, euthanasia, to basically just smear Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla's more efficient and cheaper system of alternating current. So he does use basically his tests on animals to disprove, but it wasn't Topsy. As I said, Topsy, 1903, War of the Currents, 1892, and Edison was actually out of General Electric by 1892. Now, another reason Edison is attributed to Topsy is his film industry. The famous film, which I will not show during this presentation, it's widely available on YouTube if you wish to watch it, shows the whole execution of Topsy. It's titled The Electrocuting an Elephant, excuse me. It's a short 25, 30-second film. And Edison film crew, who were actually a separate company under Edison's large umbrella of multiple companies, they're sent independently, not at the directives of Thomas Edison. He actually had very little to do in day-to-day operations, and he was actually in France at the time of the execution. The Edison film crew figured, well, people would want to see the execution of Topsy. As you saw with the photograph, there was a small crowd gathered. Some say a few dozen, some even say over 100. So they do film the execution of Topsy. So when you watch the film, you'll notice in the original version, you'll find Edison's face and Edison Industries appear before the small 30-second kinetoscope film. Edison basically viewers. And that's why most often Edison is attributed to Topsy, not only for his connection to experiments on animals and electrification in the War of the Currents, but also the film was done by an Edison company. So that's really the only connection to Edison, from Edison to Topsy, is that Edison workers installed the electricity. Edison had a past of experimenting on the electrification or the euthanasia of animals with electricity, and it was filmed by an Edison film company. So you can see when all those factors combine, people begin making connections that aren't really there. So it really shows us something about critical thinking, in my opinion. But I will show you some more lighthearted films, since it's been a pretty deep topic. And these are some of Edison films, so you can give you a good handle on how advanced the film technology was at the time. Here's a film of Annie Oakley actually doing some target practice.
From the Library of Congress in Washington.
So you can see that film, along with the Topsy film, categorized as basically everyday films. I know Annie Oakley shooting an elephant being electrocuted is not an everyday occurrence. But Edison had basically two films. He didn't do a lot of fiction or fantasy. He basically just filmed everyday things. So basically, these are more like news clips or highlights, you could say today, that people would pay a nickel to watch in a small basically viewing box. These weren't shown on the big screen until much, much later. And actually by that point, Edison is on his way out of the film industry. But basically you'd pay a nickel and watch these short little films in basically an arcade. And this one is a film with animals actually in it, a bit more fanciful, a bit more fantasy as far as Edison went. This is personally my favorite video. The cats are having gloves, so I don't think the cats are being harmed in any way. They're being held by the collar or leash. But boxing cats. So the whole trend with internet videos of cats, you could start with Edison. So there's some more lighthearted films that Edison made. He didn't just film the elephant. He filmed other everyday things. And by he, I mean his company. He had very little to do in day-to-day operations. So,
visit us at loc.gov.
So, that brings us to the discussion portion. Any questions in general about anything I've discussed in terms of Edison's role in electrocution? Any questions about Topsy, the circus industry? And I have some leading questions. You don't have to type out your answers in the chat box for these leading questions. You can if you want. But what does this say about memory and history? How people choose to remember things based on what they might have read or associated, connecting dots that might not be there, versus perhaps more serious study of history. To me, it seems as though memory is a bit foggy. Memory does have its place in terms of recording history, especially in oral history when it's recorded properly and with a strict set of methods. But when you're studying history, and especially studying history through the lens of newspapers, a lot of these newspapers, as I talked about in my first little discussion with Thomas Edison versus the Demon Shark of St. Augustine, there's a classic. You can see newspapers in the late 19th century weren't upheld to such strict standards of journalistic integrity as newspapers and media in general are held up today. So you have to be careful in reading some of these. There's a sector of the public that sees Edison as a villain based on this event and other misinformation of his business practice. Yeah, you're exactly right. If you go online, it's very easy to see, and especially on YouTube, blogs, other things throughout. A large sector of the public do view Edison as a villain, as someone, an evil man who stole people's inventions and stole and ruined Nikola Tesla's life and abused animals. And while there is some truth to all that, since be often sensationalized. But yeah, you're exactly right. Edison does have a bit of a PR issue. But one of those PR issues being our second question, should we still hold Edison accountable for his earlier experiments on dogs and horses and other animals? He was contracted by the Society for the Protection of Animals, yet he does it dozens and dozens of times. And he does use the information in not the most ethical way. So I'm not too sure what part or all of it we should hold Edison accountable as a person in terms of directing these where he, by the way, were pretty involved was. He wasn't doing it himself. He had, of course, dozens and dozens of employees under him. But he was somewhat avoidable. Oh, Adele, you want to make a speaking comment? Yeah, it's a bit of a broad question. Well, let me see if I can do that. All right, let's see if that worked.
Yeah, good. Okay. I'd like to make a comment about your last question. Mm-hmm. Have we changed in how we view animals? All animals or just some? I'm Jewish, and there's a Jewish tradition around this time of the High Holy Days of Yom Kippur. There's a weird Jewish tradition of swinging a chicken around to expiate for sins. And at first, when I was younger, I thought this seemed kind of funny, I'm ashamed to admit. But then when I realized, well, it's a chicken, but it could just as easily be a cat, and I'm a cat lover, I was horrified. So do we view all animals the same or just some? That speaks to that question. How do you value the life of a chicken? How do you value the life of a cat? That's my comment.
Well, thank you for sharing. I'll go ahead and unmute you so I can talk. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, yeah, I think that's a very broad discussion. I'm not going to solve it in the next 5 minutes. I hope you don't think I am. But yeah, you brought up a good point, especially about religious practices and the use of animals in religious practices. Some religions which do use animal sacrifice and animals in their practice. So we also have to be cognizant of the use of animals of all kinds, not just the ones we like as pets, in terms of, how are we treating some animals and why is this animal treated better than this animal? And I think it goes back to PR reasons for some animals and just societal. And that's our perspective, of course. I say we as people living in the United States, as I saw in the chat, most of you all are living in the United States. But yeah, you have to take account for different perspectives and different worldviews of different people. But Brian had a comment. I think it'll be our last one before I wrap it up. He said, no, electrical safety practices have evolved over the last 100 years. Early electrical equipments and unconventional use of electricity is a part of that history. Judging these acts with today's eyes is inappropriate and unfair to the legacy of Edison. Yeah, you are making a valid point, Brian, that it's very easy for us to judge past actions using today's morals. As I said earlier, in reference to animals and how we view them, we have to be cognizant not only in how other people view the world, but also how past peoples or how future peoples might view the world. Who's to say what we're doing isn't inappropriate? Yet at the same time, we can look to history and look to diary entries and oral histories, properly recorded oral history projects, and see, you know, some people didn't think that what other people were doing at the time was right, was ethical. You know, that constant battle of, you know, past, present, as well as tradition and modernity / progress. So we can't judge people with our morals, but I think we can judge the past with past morals of all peoples, not just that one person. You know, we can see what, you know, this person of this faith, of this country, of this background viewed this person and what they're doing, and whether or not, you know, even people in their family viewed other people as moral. It's a very big question, I know. But yeah, I think we have to examine both history in multiple ways, and that's why I like having these little discussions, so I can see what you guys are thinking. And hopefully you can have maybe some conversations with your friends and family about, you know, how we study history, how we view history, how we view what we're doing now as right or wrong. I know, very big philosophical questions for 11:30 in the morning, but something maybe to think about as you're going throughout your day. But I'll go ahead and wrap it up. I'll give it about a minute or two if there's any last minute questions. But I'll be here for about a minute or two, as I said, but we'll go ahead and start wrapping it up. And thank you so much, so much for joining us and participating in these conversations and these digital discussions. I know this one was a little morbid, but don't worry, this is the most morbid one I have. Again, next time we're going to be talking about Etzel 4 on September 2nd, followed by that a discussion on the servants, which I'm very excited about, learning more about the people who actually worked and lived with the Edisons, and who lived and worked with the Fords, and basically made their stay here in Fort Myers especially possible. And then, question on recordings. Yeah, we are trying to figure out a way to make this widely available in terms of providing a recording of these digital discussions. I am recording them, so nothing's lost, but we'll be making a decision in the next week or two about posting recordings. We might have a members only page where if you've registered for this program, you can sign into our website and watch the recording there, or we might just post it to YouTube after about a month or two after the discussion. You just, of course, won't have the discussions. But again, thank you all for talking about this issue, joining us, and supporting the Edison and Ford Winter States and our mission by participating in these talks. Thank you so much.